As you know, I'm a former editor. So I'll tell you a couple other things about a coder. I'm not a developer. I'm not an educator. It's a miracle that I can do any HTML at all. I'm not a funder. So why am I here? Because I'm a user. When you like to talk hypothetically about the people who might possibly interact with the technology that you're creating, I'm one of them. And both of parents are dead. So when I was a kid, we had a lot of interesting technology around the house. We had a flash every time the doorbell rang, for example. And for people who talk about opting into technology, I've always grown up in a culture where you just had it because that was it. And I think that's a really interesting way to approach technology, not as what will I do if, but this is the only option available to me. I'm not thinking about cool new gadgets, fancy things that we can make, pretty designs. I'm thinking about if I had no other choice, how could I use this and would I be able to? So in a way, I'm also not talking about, we talked a lot about what, and we talked a lot about how. I'm going to talk a little bit about where. So there have been a lot of references to, I think Dan called it, the Jews out in the boonies, and I was a Jew out in the boonies. So when I was growing up, really before there was widespread internet technology, I felt like my voice in the Jewish community didn't matter. I felt like I don't live in New York or Israel. Nobody cares what I think. There are no institutions nearby that cater to me. I got my hands on a copy of the Jewish Daily Forward, and I felt like I was reading another language. I didn't know any of the euphemisms. I didn't know any of the people they were quoting in the articles. They would use abbreviations for organizations that I had never heard of, and I thought, maybe I'm not welcome. Maybe this is just a whole world that I'm never going to understand. And luckily, when I was in high school, the internet became more prevalent. We had a computer at home, and I was able to go online, and I was able to look up, okay, so what do these initials stand for? Who is this organization? And start to do my own learning. So by the time I moved here, I didn't feel like I was completely outside the spectrum. I don't think that everybody needs to move to New York. I don't think that everybody needs to move to Israel. But what I love about working online is that it doesn't matter where you are, who you are, you can be involved in some way, and your voice can be heard. I think if we're talking about break down current systems that exist and challenging the people who have authority, the way to do that is to bring in as many voices as possible. And if they can't all afford to fly somewhere or move somewhere or uproot their lives and go somewhere, but they can go online, and that's something to start with. So in terms of strengthening the diaspora, I know that growing up in a tiny Jewish community, there was a lot of pressure. This place is dead, go away, it doesn't matter here, we don't even have a minion, let's just go start something. And now there's this opportunity, rather than paying Jews $25,000 and saying, hey, go move to Atlanta and we'll give you money, go move to Alabama and start a shul there, you don't need that. Instead, you can create a community wherever you are, and you can connect with people around the world. I'm probably not, to be honest, telling you things that you don't know. But what I'm trying to give perspective on here is what it's really like to use all of these applications, what it's really like to go online and try to connect with people I've never met and ask questions about Judaism, about becoming versus belonging. And I think when you don't feel like you're becoming anything, what's a good way to start? It is so embarrassing to ask questions. It is so embarrassing to be the only Jewish kid in your high school, have somebody ask you a question about Judaism and not know the answer. And think, okay, now what am I supposed to do? They're looking on me as some kind of expert of Judaism in the wilderness, and I have no idea. Now what? I dug out my parents' copy of the Jewish Book of Why, and if I couldn't find it there, I wasn't finding it anywhere. So now there's the opportunity to not be the only Jewish kid in your high school, or at the very least, go and look it up and Google it and be able to tell the kids the answer the next day. In terms of small, isolated communities, I'm not just talking about geography. I'm talking about not feeling like you're the only one. For example, part of the LGBT community, if you go online, you realize, hey, there are other people who have had the same struggles and experiences that I've had. Maybe I can interact with them. When I was running Juicy, I left in January, but I was there for about a year. And when I was running Juicy, so often, anybody who works in the Jewish organizational world, you get invited to tons of conferences, people want to talk stuff. It's a really great way to network. But at some point you wonder, am I reaching the same 50 people every single time? So I think one of the struggles that I had there was bringing in writers whose work had never been published anywhere else before, and people from Jewish communities where there wasn't a dedicated blog to serve their community. And I think these micro examples of something that I did on one particular website may not have changed the world, but in terms of how we can do these on a bigger scale, I think that's what we need to think about, is we need to realize that soon geography is not going to matter. Soon it's not going to matter where you live. Soon you're not going to be the only person who has a voice just because you work in a particular office in a particular building. I think also there's a lot of people throw around words. People say, okay, I know that I run a Jewish organization. I know that it needs to have a website. I know it needs to have a blog. I know that it needs to be on Twitter. All these things are great. However, just saying we need to be on Twitter doesn't mean that you're using it properly. And so often you see people who set up a Twitter account and all they use it for is to sort of promote whatever it is that they're working on, but there's no engagement, they don't respond to anybody, they don't retweet their followers. It starts to feel like a robot is writing it. And if you have the access to an application like that and yet you're using it in a way where it's incredibly one-sided, you might as well not bother. The advantage of being online, interact with people, and yet if you're willingly choosing to opt out of interacting with them, you might as well just not have the technology. I've seen it again and again. Organizations that have blogs and publish something once a month on the blog. Maybe they put up something once a week, but there's no person who owns the project. There's nobody who proofreads it. They don't include any links anywhere in it. The thing that they post on the blog is actually a PDF of the thing that they're working on. And so it's incredibly frustrating that people get it, they know that there's something there, they're walking right toward it, and yet there's a big thing missing. And I think, again, as I said before, it's not just about funding things because they're sexy. If it gets people in the room, that's great, but what you have to do is say, all right, you want to give us money to set up these technological projects, what are we going to do with them? Because if you don't do anything with them, you might as well just leave them in a shed somewhere and let them collect dust. You're not using them. Also, a lot of Jewish sites and a lot of sites in general, I'm very, very guilty of this, working in web media. They are designed for SEO and they are designed for traffic, but they are not always designed for users. I think when Dan was showing what happened when he Googled different, how do I do this? How can I find this Jewish thing? What came up are often, things that have Jewish in the title, which is great. People are doing a really, really good job of making sure that you can find their websites via Google, because that's a really important way to connect people with what you're working on. But if it doesn't answer the exact question, it just throws you off more. It just makes you have to look again. It just makes you frustrated and not want to try. So I think that, unfortunately, I've worked for nonprofit media, I've worked for for-profit media, and in both cases you have a problem. If you don't have funding and you're worried all about advertising, you have to get traffic up so that you can get ads up. And traffic, whatever way you can get it, traffic is more important.
Why don't you just put up some chicken?
Pictures of cats usually is good. So it becomes more about, oh, we have to please advertisers, we have to give them what they want, they're paying, rather than I want to make sure that every single person on the site loves what they see. When you work in the nonprofit sector, you're often worried more about what is our board going to think. You're worried about, keeping certain investors happy and making sure that they see a lot of people coming to the site. But unfortunately, and I've been guilty of this, you're not always worried about every single user and what they're getting out of the experience. I don't claim to have all of the answers for this. I don't claim to be an expert on any of these topics. But what I can tell you is what I learned from doing reader surveys, what I learned from asking the people who were reading the sites that I was working on how they felt and how they interacted with it. So I don't know if working at a non-Jewish site now, if I'll be invited to have more conversations. I know that I run a fashion website now. Sometimes I write about what Israeli cheerleaders are wearing, and that technically counts as a fashion story, but it's also for me a nice way to write about something Jewish. And that's ideally the goal. It doesn't have to be a specifically big site with the word Jewish on it, but it's there. And I think that more and more young people, as they're going online for their experiences, don't necessarily type the word Jewish into a search field, but if they find something that connects with their spirituality, it may be on another site, but it's a point of entry, and I think that's the important part.